Hey everyone, it's Eric with Damper 3 Reads. Thanks so much for joining us. Today we're discussing the 6 most influential fantasy writers and their works that have inspired generations of today's authors. Please stick around for the conversation. So whether you're new to the fantasy genre or you've been around the block for a while, you know that there are absolutely tons of fantasy books out there. I mean, go to any online bookstore, go to any brick and mortar bookstore, and you will just see countless different books. And every year there's more. It's like a tidal wave of new titles. See what I did there? And usually in the title somewhere they have the words dragon or blood or sword or something like that. I guarantee that most of these authors have been inspired by one or more of the authors and their works that we're going to cover today. Now, there are a lot of really good top fantasy book of all time lists out there on YouTube and elsewhere on the internet. And most of them will build up to their top pick, but we're not going to do that because we're talking fantasy books. And who are we going to kid? The gold standard of fantasy writing has been for decades now JRR Tolkien, The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. This has been the case since The Hobbit was first published in 1937, and then The Fellowship of the Ring came out in 1954, and has endured for decade after decade after decade. Now, I actually have run into people over the years that have said, you know, I've tried Tolkien, he's not for me. And you know what? That's fair. Not everyone's going to agree on everything, but I guarantee you that most of the people who don't get into Tolkien are in the vast minority. I mean, not only does The Lord of the Rings make pretty much every single fantasy top 10 list, in 2021, the New York Times conducted a poll, and the question they were asking was, what are the top 3 books written over the past 125 years? And number 2 was The Fellowship of the Ring. So this is all books. This isn't fantasy or what have you. This is all books. And The Fellowship of the Ring made that list. That's the impact that Tolkien's books had. Now, I'm not going to go over the plot of this. I mean, I think with Peter Jackson's movies, it's pretty well known at this point. But authors such as JRR Martin, Terry Brooks, and Orson Scott Card have all acknowledged the influence that Tolkien had on their works. And I'm sure it's many, many more than that. So if you haven't gotten around to reading it, or for some reason you've put it off, go ahead and revisit it. It's worth your time, and you'll definitely be able to see the fingerprints of Tolkien on so many of today's writers. Next up is probably as far away from Tolkien as you can get. I'm talking Michael Moorcock and Elric's Saga. Michael Moorcock in 1972 introduced us to his anti-hero Elric of Melniboné. Now, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right. I've called it Melniboné since I was a kid. Actually, I called it Melnibone when I first started reading it. I ignored the little accent on there. But Elric of Melniboné, I don't know. But Elric is just a fascinating character. Born an albino, Elric is a sorcerer. He wields this just horrifying weapon. And this is kind of like the crux of the story. He has this weapon called Stormbringer, which is a black blade sword with runes engraved in it. This sword provides Elric with strength and power by when he slays an enemy, it sucks in the soul and devours it and provides some of that power to Elric. And when you think of a guy who is trying to do good with a weapon like that, it really sets up for an interesting conflict throughout the series. So Elric's series and Michael Moorcock's work, it's kind of lurking in the shadows. You know, it hasn't had a movie made after it. It hasn't had a TV series, though they are optioned, as I understand it. And there's been talk about trying to turn this. This is I think, the next big fantasy blockbuster that's kind of waiting in the wings. And incidentally, writers, if you're into comic books, Alan Moore, and even more significantly, from a literary perspective, Neil Gaiman, have all said that they were inspired by the works of Michael Moorcock. So if you like their type of work, check out Elric's Saga. So we've gone from Tolkien to Michael Moorcock. Let's go to a little bit of the lighter side of things. In 1983, Terry Pratchett published The Color of Magic, which was the first of his Discworld series. And it just blows me away that in England, when this came out, they had only just over 500 copies of this printed. Most of those went to libraries. Fast forward to 2015, when the last of the Discworld novels was published, and you find 41 different books that developed the mythology of Discworld, and they're so hilarious. I've read all but six. Six of his books were YA books, young adult books, and I just never got around to reading them, though I plan on making up for that. It spawned not only the books, but there have been a number of movie versions of his books. The Hogfather. I try to watch it every Christmas. I think Netflix has a series based on the City Watch stuff, though it's kind of an artistic take on it. There's some controversy over that. But anyway, Terry Pratchett's books, a humorous and satirical take on the fantasy genre in general, and then he rolls some other things in as well. It's amazing. He kind of brings the internet into the story. But Terry Pratchett, he is such a gifted writer. There are very few people who have such a strong mastery of the English language that you're reading something and it kind of hits you on a couple different levels, and it's just absolutely hilarious. Now, the first couple of novels in the Discworld series deal with a character named Rincewind, who is a wizard, and as a wizard, he can't really cast any spells. As a matter of fact, it's Rincewind states a couple of times that he thinks it's unfair that people assume that a wizard just knows how to do magic. But after the first couple of novels, Pratchett expands his universe to include so many different characters, and the whole over the course of the decades that he wrote Discworld, there's not a single book that I did not enjoy reading out of those 30 some odd out of 35 or so novels that I've read. They're hilarious. The characters will stick with you. They're poignant sometimes, but always hilarious. If you haven't read any of the Discworld novels, give it a shot. If you're wondering which one is the best one, that's a tough one, of course. I have so many favorites, but if I had to pick, go to Guards Guards. I think Guards Guards introduces you to some of the most enduring characters that throughout the whole Discworld series. You get to meet Captain Vimes, you get to meet Corporal Nobbs and Sergeant Colin and Carrot. Just all these different characters that they're just hilarious. So if you haven't read the Discworld novels, you really got to fix that, because you will not regret it. So next, Robert E. Howard, Conan the Barbarian. A lot of folks will associate Arnold Schwarzenegger and the movies with the character of Conan. If you read comic books, of course, that's how I was introduced to Conan originally, was the comic books back in the 1980s. But I mean, Robert E. Howard's novels, actually, Conan started off similarly to Elric in that he was first introduced through magazines. There are magazine stories, weird tales, and the like. And Robert E. Howard, he was a lover of history, but only history before humanity became civilized. He thinks that once you become civilized, he's not really interested in you. So what you find is the world of Hyboria is a collection of nations that are very similar to nations in the world today. It's just most of them are pre-civilized. So you have a lot of barbarian kind of countries, to including where the Sumerian or Samaria, where Conan comes from. And Conan, his stories are just intriguing. Now, I do find that Robert E. Howard sometimes he likes to over-narrate. He kind of he over-narrates a bit. He introduces you pretty straightforward. Hi, I'm such and such from such and such country, and these are and he spells it out for you a little bit at the beginning. But they're always plotting. His stories are always about plots, wizards and sorcerers and Conan is just kind of in the middle of it. And he always rises above, of course. So, but the enduring part of Conan is that after Robert E. Howard passed, a plethora of other writers took up the mantle to tell the story of Conan. L. Sprague du Camp is the one I was most familiar with. That's the first books I read of his. But even Robert Jordan of Wheel of Time, he wrote a number of Conan novels in the 1980s or 1990s, I forget which. So Robert E. Howard has inspired authors to the present day. Switch back to Tolkien's era. In 1950, one of Tolkien's closest friends, C.S. Lewis, published The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. The Chronicles of Narnia have sold over 120 million copies. It's interesting that though Tolkien and C.S. Lewis were friends and both were devoted Christians, Tolkien was a little embarrassed for C.S. Lewis because he thought that he was hitting the reader over the head with his Christian symbology in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And of course, C.S. Lewis didn't think so. And C.S. Lewis has just created this world that's endured to this day and has inspired just any number of writers and readers since then. So, I mean, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is it's written, I think, in a similar kind of tone as The Hobbit, maybe a little bit more gritty than that as it goes along. But it's so enjoyable and definitely worth your time if you have not read. In 1996, JRR Martin published A Game of Thrones, and it became a bestseller. I think within a year, it became pretty popular, and people to this day are waiting for JRR Martin to finish his finish A Song of Fire and Ice. When it first came out, I heard about it probably 1997, and I didn't want to read it because in my mind he had to be copying Tolkien down to his name structure. I mean, how many people have two R's in their middle name? And so I wouldn't give it the time of day. And it wasn't until I heard that it was becoming a series that I sat down to read A Game of Thrones. And Westeros is not Middle-earth. Game of Thrones is not some kind of rehashing of The Lord of the Rings. It's its own complex world that is just extremely entertaining to read. Upsetting quite a lot of the time. I've come to think of it, the layered storytelling similar to Dune. Maybe not quite as complex as Dune, but I mean, all the characters as they interact have their own motivations, they're complex characters, and just the way they have to respond to, they set their own plots, they have their own agendas, they get up, everything gets thrown up into the air because other people have their own plots, and when they collide, things get ugly. So it's a very complex world that he set up. JRR Martin's a masterful writer, and has definitely inspired not just books but cinema as well. Because I think he and I think A Game of Thrones and The Walking Dead kind of established this idea that, hey, we can kill off some of our more popular characters and still survive to tell another story. So Game of Thrones, JRR Martin, worth your time, and I think it's definitely one of the most recent examples of authors who have just inspired a generation of future writers. That's what I have. I know there's some glaring omissions here. I'm not going to mention what they are right now. I got one in particular. I'm going to include it later. The reason why I'm not including it is because I read some of these books I read a long time ago, and I just have very little memory of it. And so I feel like I want to be able to know what I'm speaking about. So tell me, what foundational, influential fantasy books do you know of that you think every fantasy fan should read? Let me know in the comments, and welcome to D3 Reads. Please like and subscribe and share us, and I'll see you later, BookTube.